Good morning again. My name is Eric Bates. I'll just read out the title for the recording for the lads there. Exploring the learning experiences of brick and stonework apprentices in the Republic of Ireland on the Irish Standards-Based Apprenticeship Programme. And this is derived from a broader study that I did as part of the doctorate with Queen's University in Belfast, and for which I have to acknowledge Dr. Dina Bellucci, who was my supervisor on that. She was great. Just a little bit about my background, because you'll understand the context of why I research what I do. I served a 4-year craft apprenticeship in the early 90s in paint and decorating in Dublin in Ireland. I was lucky enough to start teaching on the apprenticeship programme in 2000, back in the institute where I was an apprentice as a much younger man. Once I started teaching, I really kind of got involved in it, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to do an honours degree through my institute. I focused on psychology, which I found really, really interesting. I went on to do a master's degree, again, because of the place I worked. They were very good in terms of funding that and giving you time off to do it. They were very, very interested in lifelong learning, and they wanted staff to go on and get further qualifications as well. And I completed my doctorate in 2022. And again, I have to acknowledge, they funded that all the way along the way, which was fantastic. So now, having started off on apprenticeship programs, I teach across a broader range of programs, usually related to construction. I supervise some master stuff as well. But anytime I get an opportunity to carry out research, I'm always interested in apprentices, because it has changed very much from when I was an apprentice to what an apprenticeship is now in Ireland. So this is the system that I worked on, which was, it felt this, for me in the 90s, this felt like I was on a holiday, because you worked your 4 days with your employer, and then 1 day a week you got to go into what we call tech. And that felt like a holiday. You got to learn from the best in the business. You were off the site. There was a nice warm room. You weren't dirty. There was good toilets, stuff like that. But at the time, it was a time-served apprenticeship, which meant you actually didn't have to do your exams. You just had to attend. And at the end of the year, the exams were optional. So we had a lot of people who were time-served, but who had not actually carried out any assessments. Now, that caused an awful lot of issues in terms of the quality of training that people received, and then the quality of the apprentices who went out into the workplace, because you had this variation, because all you had to do was turn up, register and turn up. So they changed this in the 90s to what they call a standards-based apprenticeship. It refers really to craft apprenticeships, paint and decorating, carpentry and joinery, stuff like that. And it changed from what I experienced, which was that day release, which felt like a holiday from the workplace, 1 day a week, you were no longer there. They changed that to this idea of block release. So what you had was, you had an intense period of 20 weeks, 10 weeks, 10 weeks, in which you were in a training centre or a university or an IT. And that meant that the apprentices were coming in and sitting in the classroom for hours on end, and then doing a little bit of practical, but an awful lot of sitting in the classroom for hours on end. And that didn't really suit an awful lot of apprentices. And it was for 10 weeks. So to a lot of them, it felt like they were going back to school. The government now paid for the training of the apprentice, and the idea was that the employers weren't carrying the cost, so they would send more and more in to get trained and to reach a proper standard, and then the quality of our apprentices would go up. That's just a snapshot of what it's like. Now, it's 7 phases. You must complete your assessments in order to pass. They go to a training centre. Phases 2, 4, and 6 is basically off-the-job training, where they go to a training centre, and then they come into a university to us for 10 weeks in phase 4 and phase 6. But they must pass the exams. That's the big difference in what they're doing in comparison to the previous system. You must pass your exams. And for the place where I work, we're not the awarding body. It is not our program. We have not written the curriculum. We're just simply subcontractors who implement the phase 4 and the phase 6 of that. So we don't have control. We don't have an awful lot of control over what we're delivering. We have to do it to what they have already told us to do. It still takes 4 years to do it. Over those, it could take longer, because if they fail, they must repeat the assessment. And you only get certain opportunities to repeat the assessment in order to come back and do it. So for me, teaching across these other programs and seeing the differences in apprentices and what they were experiencing in comparison to when I look back, for me, looking back at my apprenticeship was a halcyon time and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. But I was getting different senses from apprentices nowadays. And in our place, we have in TU Dublin, we have this feedback process. We call it the Q5 process. And at the end of every semester and every module, you ask the student, how did you get on? Give us some feedback, etc., etc. And all that feedback goes into another form, which actually goes into the faculty action plan. And basically, they're listened to and they try to change things in accordance with what the feedback was from the full-time students. There's also a national survey for that goes out nationally to all full-time students. But there's nothing for apprentices at any level. They don't ask for any feedback at all from apprentices at any level. In addition, a lot of the curricula were rewritten, but they were never implemented. So, for example, the paint and decorating, the brick and stone work, wood manufacturing and finishing, they were all rewritten, but they have never changed. They've never put them into place. So the curricula that we're delivering now are over 20 years old. And yet, at the same time, we're supposed to be delivering industry-ready apprentices, but we're delivering a curricula that's 20 years old. And the assessments are somewhat similar in terms of being a little bit outdated. So the aim of this study, I was getting a lot of the feedback from apprentices as to how they were getting on. So I wanted to really explore it. And I had that opportunity as a result of the doctorate to dive a little bit deeper into it and to see what it is that they felt or how they experienced what it was like being an apprentice going through this type of curriculum. So this bit focuses on the brick and stone work. The broader study has the wood manufacturers and finishes in it as well. So 20 participants were recruited, only 12 took part. I used the semi-structured interviews using practice architectures, which I'll talk about very briefly, and I analysed it using interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA. Now, in constructing, when I set out to do the study, when I went to do the actual interview schedule, I came across this idea of practice architectures. I don't know if you've come across it. I only came across it as I was doing this, never heard it before. It just seemed to me to be something that I could utilise. I think it's a couple of Australians, forgive me if I'm wrong on that, they basically came up with this. They kind of evolved it from practice theory and communities of practice. I didn't delve too much into those because when I was reading about this stuff really resonated with me when I was reading about this. And they were talking about these things like the language, the material, the social relationships that form a practice. And then they were talking about it as almost like a collective memory. And when I think back on my apprenticeship, in many ways, I felt like I was going into a club where they were using a language and saying things and doing things that I didn't recognize. They would use phrases. I could work with a fella this week who I never met. And then in 2 weeks, be working with another guy. And he would use the same language, that the same phrasing, the way he said things. He would refer to things in the same way. And it felt like I was an outsider in this club where they all had these ways and means of doing things. So when I came across this practice architecture and this idea of the collective memory, it really felt to me like as if I had hit something that meant something to me. And so what I tried to do with it was, I tried to structure my interview schedule around this idea of these three parts of it. So for example, now I did 30 questions on the semi-structured interview. So the one part of it was talking about the language that was being used. So I asked this question as when you started out as a first year, was it difficult to understand what you were being told or asked to do? And that's what I was thinking of when I was a first year, that I didn't quite get what they were saying to me. They used to call ceilings lids. When they say to you, you're going on to the ceiling, you wouldn't say that, they say you're going on to the lids. And I'd look around at the tins of paint for the lids on the tins of paint. And they'd have to say, no, the lids. This is the type of thing I'm talking about. So I wanted to see, did this type of thing exist, or did the apprentices in modern time go through this type of thing? And because it's semi-structured, you see I have the prompts there as well, giving me the ability to try and draw a little bit more out. The doings. What was the situation when you started your apprenticeship? Again, for me as a young man, I noticed that all the people I was working with seemed to be from the same background. They early school leavers. They seem to have gone through the same type of thing that I had gone through. I wanted to see, was that the situation now with these apprentices? And again, there's prompts there asking them for other things. And then the relationship's really critical in terms of my early apprenticeship, working with a foreman, working with other people, working for the customer. What was that like? How did you get on with that? So how are those relationships now? And I'm thinking of what you were like. Like when I was an apprentice, you were very much, I was referred to, even though I was 18 when I started, I was referred to as the boy. The boy. So they'd say, get the boy to go to the shop. And I'd look around, who are they talking about? And they'd say, no, you're the boy. And I'm like, well, I'm not a boy. Well, you are a boy. These could be people who are 22, 23. I was 18 and I was the boy. Get the boy to foot the ladder. And it's only when I finished serving my apprenticeship that they stopped calling me the boy. Now I was a man. So I wanted to see, did this type of thing happen now? Because in Ireland, the demographic of our apprentices has changed. We don't get 16 and 18-year-olds now. They come into us. The oldest apprentice I have taught was a man who was 60, came into the class. Now, there's lifelong learning for you. And everybody who used to walk into that room went up to him to ask a question because they thought he was the teacher, just based on the fact of his age. Okay, so this was the interview schedule. I also asked a little bit about where they asked for any input or feedback, etc., when they finished serving their time. And I gave them the opportunity to add in anything that I might have missed. So anything at all that I might have missed. Now, as it turned out, much to my disappointment, because I have a massive section of it in my doctorate, that practice architecture framework did not relate in any way whatsoever to anything that they were experiencing. It was a little bit of a crisis for me when I was analysing the data. My supervisor told me, no, keep it in. You have to let people see that this didn't work, and it really didn't work. There was no overlapping between anything that I had structured and anything that they had. The demographics, the backgrounds, the relationships, it just wasn't there whatsoever. So anyway, I left it in. So the apprentices, they were drawn from a phase 6 program. There's only one centre who deals with it, so nobody was missing out, if you know what I mean. Emails, phone calls, called into classes. This is how they were recruited. I was doing all this during the height of the coronavirus, which was really exciting and great. I got in contact with 39 participants, and I didn't get that many. I contacted them, but they didn't take part. What happened in Ireland at the time? We had a data hack of